Welcome to COVID-19 Insights Podcast. How do we survive and thrive in the Decade of Action? By ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue, or ACS-DSD, which is hosted at the College of Management, Mahidol University.
Welcome to my Sufficiency Thinking and COVID-19 Recovery in ASEAN podcast. My name is Dr. Phumchai Naksakun. I'm an adjunct professor with Chulalongkorn University, where I give lectures on data science, quantitative analytics, and machine learning topics. I'm also a private consultant on data science project and transformation at an asset management house here in Thailand. Now, today, I have the honor of being invited to speak on behalf of the ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue, or ACS-DSD, on the very timely topic of sufficiency thinking and COVID-19 recovery in ASEAN. My talk will be produced as ACS-DSD podcast intended for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to distribute amongst ASEAN countries. But first, you might wonder why a data scientist / consultant / university lecturer would have anything whatsoever to do with today's topic, much less have some useful insights to contribute to the conversation. So perhaps a little bit of my personal background is in order. I have a bachelor's degree in physics and economics with a double major, a master's degrees in operations research with finance minor, both from Case Western Reserve University in the United States. I also have a PhD in operational research and computational intelligence from Imperial College, University of London, the latter on the Bank of Thailand scholarship. Now, upon graduation, I embarked upon the central banker's career, but without mainstream central banker's traditional background, which at that time essentially meant being schooled in neoclassical economic maxims. Fully informed, rational agents behaving rationally to maximize their utility functions, corporate entities tasked with umpteenth degree of profit maximization, supposedly on moral ground, all that. But perhaps more crucial to the story is that I graduated in the summer of 1998 and entered the Bank of Thailand in autumn. 1998 being 1997 plus 1. 1997 being the year of the financial crisis. And while I played no active role in the recovery effort, I did get involved in some quote-unquote post-mortem analysis, solving such paradox as to why a major bankruptcy didn't happen to a company with unhedged FX position, but rather the one that hedged FX position on the cheap, as it were. This was done through what must have seemed at that time as some clever financial engineering trick, but one that ultimately backfired. Essentially, this firm reduced premium on protection against small fluctuation or small adverse FX movement by actually doubling down on the risk of extreme, hitherto unimaginable but eventually realized market scenario. This is what today we'll call toxic financial products. Now, on a grander scheme of things, perhaps it wasn't just a matter of financial engineering faux pas or even the escalating layers upon layers of financial market hubris that set the stage for the biggest financial crisis of a generation. Rather, the entirety of the artifice of economic paradigm was rotten at the core. Superficial in the past, dysfunctional in the present, and sustainable into the future. And that's where the long-ignored voice of sufficiency thinking gained a new audience. And for many economic scholars, the true message rang true, loud and clear, perhaps for the first time in their career. And yet the neoclassical dogmatists wouldn't sway. For them, economic treatises had to have fancy equations, which meant They had to deal exclusively with measurable quantities. In other words, price, not value. Yearly, quarterly percentage growth, not long-term sustainability. Synergy for percentage gain in productivity, throughput, not cooperation for social cohesion. Maximization of shareholder returns, not emancipation of human dignity. Now, because I grew up on a healthy diet of mathematics being the language of science, especially physics, as well as a core toolset in operational research and computational intelligence, if I were to be impressed by economic treatise, it would not be for their formulas. It would be for their insights, not formulas. It was then that I got life-changing opportunity to join a small team of proper economic theorists and thinkers and young researchers. This was led by Dr. Priyanut Thammapiya, then at NDSDB. As I recall, we mostly met after office hours on weekend. But don't hold me to that account. I don't quite remember. Anyway, we were tasked with a simple question. Does sufficiency economy philosophy constitute economic theory proper? And the short answer I can give you is yes. Now, having satisfied ourselves with that homework, the team then sought to encapsulate the key essence of sufficiency thinking into a compact set of precepts, ones that could be easily communicated to lay audience, with diagrams and visualization and so on. So let me briefly discuss what we came up with so that we'll have enough necessary ingredients from sufficiency thinking part so that we can go on and discuss and tackle the COVID-19 recovery in ASEAN part of this podcast. Okay, let's talk about sufficiency economy philosophy. In a way, if you think about it, any and all economic theory must cover any of these four areas of question. First, there is the fundamental drive question. That is what it is exactly that gets us out of bed in the morning. What drives us on a fundamental level? Second, we have to deal with the decision-making questions. How we as individuals decide to spend our time, money, efforts. How companies decide on pricing, product strategies, production parameters, supply chain configuration, and whatnot. Third, the economic institutions. How commercial and investment banks function as financial intermediaries. How central banks exert cybernetical control vis-a-vis the macroeconomic engine, so forth. And fourth, must deal with system dynamics question. How an economy grow? Why do crises erupt? Will inflation get out of control? How are global economies economically linked and financially interconnected, and so on? Well, our team came up with the conclusion that while sufficiency economy philosophy is broad, that is, in the sense of being applicable to all four aforementioned areas of investigation, as well as deep, that is, in the sense of being applicable to individual deep dive hypotheses, it was also our opinion that the bulk of academic as well as public discussions when it came to sufficiency thinking tended to focus just around the decision-making aspect of an economic theory. We thought that the academic community at the time and even thereafter barely spent any effort fleshing out the implication of sufficiency economy philosophy on other three areas of questions. The fundamental drive, economic institutions, and system dynamics question. Well, nonetheless, the team pushed on to leverage the decision-making angle and came up with what came to be known as the triple hoops and double conditionalities. Sort of like a meme or a way of memorizing or communicating the basic ideas and precepts to interested academics and general public alike. Now, to propel the narrative today, let's assume that the audience are mostly ASEAN public policy makers. You guys are responsible for the design and implementation of policy measures in general, COVID-19 recovery in particular. At the risk of oversimplification, this is how it works. If the design of your policy measure successfully passes through the triple hoops, navigating through the definition, then is considered consistent with sufficiency economy philosophy. If the implementation of said policy measure satisfies the double conditionalities, then it will achieve sustainability. In a microcosmic sense, this means your policy measure will achieve sustainable results for itself. In a macrocosmic sense, this means that the result of your policy measure will have positive impact vis-a-vis the greater global sustainability challenges. Now, the triple hoops, what are they? Well, let's call them moderation, reasonableness, and immunization. These are not independent concepts. They are conceptually congruent and so work together, sometimes in tandem, often in parallel. The design of your policy only has to pass through one, but of course 2 is better and 3 makes it the sweet spot, so to speak. Conversely, if it's found to have failed in just one hoop, chances are you're pretty sure that you can verify that it will also fail against the other 2 hoops as well. So let's talk about the hoops themselves. First one, moderation. Moderation characterizes your policy measures as being optimal solution. And optimal solutions are not driven by or to the extremes. Now be careful though, you don't pass through the moderation hoop by taking 2 opposing positions and finding the exact middle ground. You know, if one end is science-based findings on global climate change, and the other is wishful thinking or science denial, the midway position is still wrong. Second hoop is reasonableness. Reasonableness characterizes your policy measure as being reasoned against causal chains, capable of standing up to the scrutiny at every underlying causal nexus contained or hidden therein. This reasoning against causal chains, in my opinion, is deeply rooted in Oriental philosophy. You know, there's a saying or the wisdom that you never actually get to solve a problem by attacking the problem itself. Although this might seem the most obvious, as the scratching where it itches saying goes. No, in fact, whatever the problem is, you solve it by extinguishing the factors that form the causal chains leading to the emergence of said problem. It's a bit like firefighting, especially with forest fires. Firefighters, they rarely, if ever, put out the fire directly. Rather, their job is to remove one or more of the 3 fundamental factors that all together make the fire possible in the first place. That is, fuel for combustion, heat, and oxygen. Now let's turn to the third hoop, immunization. I must admit that on first reading, immunization first strikes me as mere generalization of the Western concept of risk management. After all, I spent more than half of my central banking careers involved in modeling financial risk and risk management methodologies in some form or another. But no, immunization works exactly the way it sounds. Immunization characterizes your policy measure if it works by introducing to the vulnerable sector you're trying to protect a weakened or harmless form of greater and genuine threat. and making sure response programs are put in place before true threats materializes. Constructing check dams and allocating lands for storm drainage work on this principle. Educating youth on the reality of viral marketing campaign, political puppeteering, fake news, and manufactured pop cultures work on this principle. Preparing vulnerable communities for encroaching globalization, commercialization forces work on this principle. And of course, the actual medical vaccination works on this principle. Okay, now, let's assume that the design of your policy measure has made it this far. It has earned enough sufficiency economy kudos to proceed onto the implementation stage. The double conditionalities, let's call them knowledge and ethics, are a little bit tricky actually. For sure, for the implementation of your policy measure to achieve sustainable results and contribute to the global sustainability solution, you must know what you're doing and be ethical about it. But these double conditionalities are more than just about being knowledgeable and ethically minded. For example, you also need to be cognizant of the boundary of your knowledge, i.e., knowing when your problem isn't a nail, when all you have is a hammer. In fact, I would go so far as to contend that knowing when you ran out of knowledge is that rarest intellectual acumen that is sadly lacking. Not just amongst the general public, as any visit to the comment section of any social network platform can attest, but perhaps more dangerously amongst the top echelons of academic scholars and public policy makers. Now, finally, you also need to live with the fact that right solutions don't always produce outcomes at the right time. Right time in the sense of right when you want it. As the reasonableness principle should have it, you don't so much make things happen as you do gather enough factors in the causal chains to let whatever it is you want to happen. So amongst the ethical qualities you need, honesty and integrity being the obvious ones, I would maintain that forbearance and grit are also critical ethical qualities. Parenthetically, you can almost say that forbearance and grit are indeed already part of the definition of the word integrity, because you stick to it, you stay true to it, despite the fact that you don't get the results when you want it. And it takes forbearance and grit and determination. Now, let's turn to what many of you are really interested in, COVID-19 recovery in ASEAN. Right away, let me just say it. I don't have the solution for you. Saying I do would be a breach of the limit of my knowledge, the very sin I'm accusing many of my peers of. But I can certainly do two things here. First, I can challenge those of you who are responsible for the design and implementation of policy measures in general, COVID-19 recovery in particular, to just try this. Try to run the design through the triple hoops of moderation, reasonableness, and immunization. Draw a little Venn diagram on a piece of paper and see where your thoughts and ideas land. Second, I can certainly espouse the value of analyzing the specificities pertaining to the present COVID-19 pandemics, that is, how we got here, and the recovery plan, that is, how to get out of here, from moderation, reasonableness, and immunization perspectives. How we got here, of course, is a lesson in what would happen when your policy measures don't go through any and all the triple hoops. I'll just briefly mention one as a mental exercise. Of course, the coronavirus is traced to the live animal market. But did you know that today's live animal markets can trace their origin to the policy measure that was aimed to address poverty? Literally, it was a poverty alleviation effort for the rural farmers. So you can almost say that it actually had a very justifiable beginning, a very good beginning. Now, of course, the mental exercise here is to examine the unintended causal chains of events in relation to the reasonableness hoop. How something that seemed right and justified in the beginning led to the disaster we have today. Now, once you're done with that little mental exercise, perhaps go for a meatier assignment. I would suggest you pick up the book Date 8 by renowned Zambian economist Dambisa Moyo. Just go through it with the aim of listing as many unreasonableness red flags as you can find. Now let's turn to COVID-19 recovery, the how to get out of here part. This, of course, is the more germane part of our discussion today. Once again, let me stress that I don't have the solution, but I do have hunches. And my hunches are that moderation will be what best governs the manner in which our recovery effort engages our public discourse. Reasonableness will best govern the manner in which our recovery effort engages the medical scientific community. And finally, immunization will best govern the manner in which our recovery effort engages our younger next generation. So if you can imagine, I'm kind of making a one-to-one map between each hoops and the engagement target, as it were. Let's go through them one by one. The reason I think that moderation hoop will matter most vis-a-vis public discourse is that any remedial plans of any kind, post-disaster, post-catastrophe recovery, must begin with a multi-criteria, multi-objective solution crafting exercise. And like I said, any optimal solution will be characterized by moderation. Not driven by, not driven to extremes. But of course, I'm being a little bit vague here, but I hope you do get the gist of my argument. The reason I think that reasonableness hoop will matter most vis-a-vis medical scientific community is that how we go about solving one aspect of the recovery of the problem will invariably impact other aspects within the overall recovery program. Positively, negatively, randomly, and surprisingly. So it's crucial to examine the causal nexus amongst all the individual factors. Now, the reason I think that immunization hoop will matter most vis-a-vis our younger next generation is simply a recognition that as long-term impacts of climate changes becomes near-term event, materializes as systemic disturbances, especially involving diseases and pathogens, it will be the younger or next generation that bear the brunt. They will have to be, figuratively speaking, vaccinated. Hitherto dormant viral strains awoken from thaw permafrost, marine ecosystem breakdowns due to disruptions, even reverses in oceanic convection, environmental refugees and displaced population, to name but a few. Now, let's be a little bit optimistic. I'd like to end on an optimistic note. In my humble opinion, ASEAN countries in particular are not starting from an absolutely miserable point. the majority of our people do not have this predisposition or this prejudice against government issued safety measures, for example. Not yet anyway. So we don't view the mandate to wear masks in public spaces as attack on personal liberty. As a side note, let me give you an example. Back in, I believe, March, April, or May, I found myself with some free time during the lockdown. So I wrote a little mathematical application. Basically, it was considered a compartmental model in biology, how disease spreads. And then I used the data up to March or April, I think, to calibrate the models and do a forward projection for 120, 180 days. Well, my prediction for case count as well as death count for Thailand was nearly spot on. I would dare say within plus minus 1% of error. This was because given the government's measure and the Thai people's cooperation, the disease or the epidemic worked itself out in a predictable manner. Now, when I look at my result, again, looking back after 120 days, 180 days has passed, when I look at the case for the United States, it's an entire failure. My model was predicting that the case was gonna peter out, when in fact we actually had a second spike, stronger than the first. So if the issue became so politicized and people became aggravated for whatever reason and dramatically changed their willingness to cooperate, then the mathematical model just couldn't anticipate that. Right. But let's be a little bit cautious here. I want to be optimistic, but I also want to throw out a little caution. One thing that I want to point out that is perhaps not unique, but particularly relevant to ASEAN countries, is what I saw as the speed or the readiness with which our people in the ASEAN countries became very dependent on digital platform solution, especially during lockdown. Now, certainly that was a good thing, considering the alternative is person-to-person commerce amidst pandemics. But you have to admit, at least for myself, I get nervous anytime any pattern of quote-unquote dependency emerges. You can argue that dependency is the antithesis to sufficiency. So of course, being invested and interested and intrigued and a convert in sufficiency economy philosophy, you could say that I'm nervous on philosophical ground. Still, I want to put this caution out there, and that's pretty much it for me. A slightly long-winded podcast, perhaps, in my opinion, but I hope you'll find it useful in some way. Now, if you want to read up a bit more, especially on my ideas of tying in sufficiency economy philosophy with, say, modern regime or financial risk management, please feel free to just Google my name, PWOMJAINACASKUL, and the word sufficiency economy or risk management. And if you want to see how my COVID analytics work, you can also Google my names with COVID analytics. There'll be a YouTube channel that demonstrate the program. Again, it was right on the mark when it came to Thai data. That will be on YouTube, so please look that up. And once again, that's it for me. I hope it's been useful and at least thought-provoking. And I wish you all the very best. Thank you.